The street was cold, the mud was wet, and the rich kid thought humiliating a homeless veteran would make a perfect viral video. He laughed as the old soldier wiped dirty slush from his face. But he didn't hear the thunder approaching. 100 Hell's Angels were watching. The damp chill of a Seattle November has a way of seeping through clothes, skin, and muscle, settling deep into the bone. For Sebastian Bennett, it was a cold he had grown entirely too familiar with over the last 5 years. At 62 years old, Sebastian was a ghost in the city he once called home. He sat on a piece of heavily taped cardboard outside a high-end steakhouse in Pioneer Square, his back pressed against the freezing brick. He wore a faded, oversized olive-drab jacket, its left sleeve bearing the faint, ghostly outline of where a 1st Marine Division patch used to sit. Beneath his gray, unkempt beard, his jaw was permanently set in a hard line of physical remnant of the tension he had carried since the Gulf War, and later the bloody, dust-choked streets of Fallujah. Sebastian didn't beg. He never asked for money. He simply sat with a small, water-damaged sign that read, "Combat Veteran. Just need peace." Most people walked past him without a second glance, treating him as though he were just another piece of urban decay, a fixture of the pavement to be stepped around. He was used to the invisibility. In fact, on most days he preferred it. Invisibility meant safety. It meant he didn't have to engage with a world that felt entirely alien to the one he had fought for. But on this particular Tuesday evening, invisibility was not on the menu. The heavy oak doors of the steakhouse swung open, spilling golden light and the smell of expensive, dry-aged beef onto the wet sidewalk. A burst of raucous, entitled laughter followed. Out stepped Chad Harrington. Chad was 24, the son of a prominent regional real estate magnate. He wore a tailored cashmere overcoat, a sneer that seemed permanently etched into his clean-shaven face, and the heavy gold watch that cost more than the average American made in 3 years. He was flanked by his usual entourage, his right-hand sycophant, a loud-mouthed frat brother named Logan, and 2 young women shivering in dresses meant for an indoor VIP lounge. Not the freezing Seattle air. Chad had been drinking. The flush in his cheeks and the careless, sweeping gestures of his hands told the story of a man who had consumed several $100s worth of bourbon and felt like he owned the concrete he stood on. He clicked the button on his keys and a pristine, unnecessarily lifted black Mercedes G-Wagon chirped to life at the curb, directly in front of where Sebastian was sitting. Between the curb and the heavy tires of the G-Wagon lay a deep, treacherous puddle of freezing mud and city runoff, collected from hours of relentless afternoon rain. "Chad, babe, unlock it. It's freezing," one of the women whined, wrapping her arms around herself. Hold on," Chad slurred, fishing for his phone. "Logan, get in frame. Look at this." Chad's eyes had landed on Sebastian. To Chad, Sebastian wasn't a human being. He wasn't a man who had lost his youth and peace of mind in the blistering heat of the Middle East. To Chad, Sebastian was a prop, a punchline for his next social media story. "Look at this guy," Chad said loudly, aiming his phone's camera at the old man huddled against the wall. Hey, old man. You want some peace? Why did you get a job, you absolute parasite?" Sebastian didn't look up. He pulled his collar tighter around his neck, staring fixedly at the wet pavement. He had survived mortar fire. He could survive the drunken taunts of a boy in an expensive coat. "He's ignoring you, bro," Logan laughed, egging him on. "He's probably deaf, or just completely wasted." "Hey, I'm talking to you." Chad barked, stepping closer. The alcohol was making him aggressive, amplifying his inherent cruelty. He didn't like being ignored. In Chad's world, when he spoke, people listened. They scrambled. Sebastian finally raised his head. His eyes, a pale and striking blue, locked onto Chad's. There was no fear in them, only an ocean of exhaustion. "Leave me alone, son," Sebastian said. His voice was gravelly, quiet but carrying the undeniable weight of authority. "Just get in your car and go home." Being called son by a man in dirty clothes made something snap in Chad's fragile ego. His face twisted with rage. "Excuse me? Do you know who I am? I pay the taxes that keep your lazy ass on this sidewalk." Chad marched toward the driver's side of the G-Wagon. But instead of getting in, he stopped right at the edge of the massive mud puddle. He looked at the muddy water, then back at Sebastian, a vicious smile spreading across his face. "You want something for free, old man?" Chad sneered. Here, with a sudden, violent kick, Chad drove his expensive leather boot deep into the puddle. A massive wave of freezing, filthy water, thick with black street mud, cigarette butts, and oil, launched directly onto Sebastian. The mud hit Sebastian directly in the chest and face. It soaked his cardboard sign, instantly turning the paper to mush. It splattered across his cheeks, dripping down into his beard, and soaked through the thin layers of his jacket. The sheer, shocking cold of the water made Sebastian gasp, his eyes shutting tight against the grit. Logan burst into hysterical laughter. The women gasped, a mix of shock and amused horror. "There's your handout," Chad cackled, holding his phone up to capture Sebastian, wiping the thick, freezing mud from his eyes. "Get a job, you piece of trash." Sebastian didn't yell. He didn't lunge. He simply sat there, shivering violently now as the icy water seeped to his skin, slowly using his muddy sleeve to wipe his face. The humiliation was heavy, suffocating. He looked at the tattered, ruined remains of his combat veteran sign, now just a pile of brown pulp. He felt an old, familiar darkness creeping up in his chest, the feeling of being entirely abandoned by the world. Chad laughed, turning to open his car door. "Did you get that, Logan? That's going viral. Let's get out of here before he gives us a disease." But Chad never got to open his door, because suddenly the ground beneath their feet began to vibrate. It started as a low, guttural vibration that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the surrounding buildings. The water in the puddle next to Chad's boot began to ripple in tight, rhythmic, concentric circles. "What the hell is that?" Logan asked, his laughter dying in his throat. He looked down the dark, rain-slicked avenue. The sound grew. It wasn't the hum of city traffic or the screech of a subway train. It was a mechanical, synchronized roar, a deep, bone-rattling thunder that chewed up the silence of the night and spit it out. The sheer volume of it bounced off the brick and glass of the Seattle skyline, amplifying until it felt like a physical pressure against the chest. Then headlights pierced the misty darkness. Not 2 or 10, but dozens of them, cutting through the damp night air like searchlights. Rounding the corner onto the avenue came a massive pack of motorcycles. Heavy, customized Harley-Davidsons, their chrome gleaming under the streetlights, their V-twin engines barking with unbridled aggression. They were riding in a tight, disciplined, 2x2 formation that stretched entirely down the block. The sheer mass of the convoy was staggering. There were easily 100 of them, and they were all wearing the same colors. On their backs, the iconic winged death's head. The top rocker proudly read, "Hell's Angels." Chad froze, his hand still resting on the door handle of his gay wagon. The smug grin had completely vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, icy apprehension. The bikers were taking up all 4 lanes of the avenue, moving at a slow, deliberate crawl. The noise was deafening. The smell of high-octane fuel and hot exhaust instantly overpowered the scent of Chad's expensive cologne. At the very front of the pack rode a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. His name was Michael "Iron Mike" Gallagher, the president of the local charter. Mike was a massive man in his late 50s, sporting a thick, graying mustache and a leather cut that had seen more miles in history than Chad Harrington could ever comprehend. Mike was leading a memorial run. They were coming back from a ride honoring a fallen brother who had served in the military, a tradition the charter took with dead serious reverence. As the front of the pack rolled past the steakhouse, Iron Mike squeezed his clutch, slowing his bike to a crawl. His eyes, sharp and taking in everything, swept the sidewalk. He saw the flashy gay wagon. He saw Chad, phone still in hand, looking like a deer caught in the headlights. And then Mike saw Sebastian. Mike saw the old man shivering violently against the wall, covered head to toe in freezing street mud. He saw the puddle, he saw the direction of the splash, and he saw the malicious, mocking posture Chad had just been striking. But more importantly, Beneath the layer of filth on Sebastian's jacket, Mike recognized something else. He saw the faint outline of the Marine Corps emblem on Sebastian's collar and the unmistakable posture of a broken brother in arms. Mike didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply raised his left fist high into the air. Instantly, the roaring thunder of 100 motorcycles shifted tone. Brakes squealed. Boots hit the pavement. Like a highly trained military unit, the massive convoy came to a complete, synchronized halt, effectively blocking the entire street. The G-Wagon was entirely boxed in. There was nowhere for Chad to drive, nowhere to run. Hey, what are they doing?" Logan stammered, stepping back toward the restaurant doors. The two women had already retreated inside, terrified. Chad swallowed hard, trying to project a confidence he suddenly did not feel. "Nothing. They're just passing by. Just get in the car." But they weren't passing by. Iron Mike killed his engine. The sudden silence that fell over the street was almost more intimidating than the roar had been. The only sound was the ticking of hot exhaust pipes cooling in the night air. Mike swung his heavy boots over his bike and stepped onto the pavement. He didn't take off his leather gloves. Behind him, two other massive men, the chapter's sergeant-at-arms, a scarred giant named Dutch Randalind, and a heavily tattooed member known simply as Bones, dismounted and flanked him. Down the line, dozens of other Hell's Angels began shutting off their engines, crossing their arms and turning their collective, unblinking gaze toward the sidewalk. 100 men, hard men. Men who lived by a code of respect that Chad Harrington had just spectacularly violated. Mike walked slowly toward the curb. He ignored Chad completely at first, walking straight past the trembling young man and crouching down next to Sebastian. "You all right, brother?" Mike asked, his deep voice cutting through the tension. He pulled a clean blue bandana from his back pocket and gently offered it to Sebastian. Sebastian looked up, taking the bandana with a shaking, muddy hand. He wiped his eyes, looking at the towering biker in front of him. "I'm fine," Sebastian rasped, his teeth chattering from the freezing water. "Just caught some mud." "You didn't catch mud, Marine," Mike said quietly, his eyes dropping to the ruined, pulpy mess of the cardboard sign on the ground. He could just make out the word veteran. "Mud doesn't jump." Mike slowly stood up. He turned his body, his massive frame blocking the streetlights, casting a long, dark shadow over Chad. Dutch and Bones stepped up slightly behind Mike, cracking their knuckles, their faces devoid of any amusement. Chad took a step back, his back hitting the door of his Mercedes. He tried to puff out his chest, leaning on the only thing that had ever protected him in his life, money and status. "Look, guys," Chad said, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't want any trouble. This is my car. I'm just trying to leave." Iron Mike took one slow step forward. He was close enough now that Chad could smell the leather and the road dirt on him. "You don't want trouble," Mike repeated, his voice dangerously low, a calm before a devastating storm. "You kick street sludge into the face of a man who fought for your right to breathe. You laugh about it with your little friends, and you think you can just get in your daddy's truck and drive away. He was harassing us." Chad lied, his panic rising as he looked past Mike and saw 30 more Hell's Angels stepping off the curb, silently forming a massive, impenetrable half-circle around the car. "He was begging and getting aggressive. He's a liar," Sebastian said quietly from the ground, finding his voice. "I never said a word to him." Mike didn't look back at Sebastian. He kept his steely gaze locked onto Chad's terrified eyes. "I believe the Marine," Mike said softly. Dutch chuckled darkly from behind Mike. "What do you want to do, boss?" Mike reached out with one heavily gloved hand and gently, almost politely, plucked the expensive smartphone right out of Chad's trembling fingers. Chad was too paralyzed by fear to resist. Mike looked at the screen, seeing the video Chad had just recorded of Sebastian being splashed. "You think this is funny," Mike said, his voice dropping an octave. "You think disrespect is a joke? Well, boy, we're going to teach you a lesson about respect, and you're going to learn it the hard way." The silence in the street was absolute. Chad Harrington stood pinned against the cold steel of his Mercedes G-Wagon, surrounded by a wall of leather and unblinking stares. The 100 Hells Angels hadn't drawn weapons. The sheer physical presence of 100 hardened men acting in perfect unison was far more terrifying than any drawn blade. Iron Mike Gallagher held Chad's expensive smartphone in his massive hand. The screen glowed, the paused video of Sebastian shivering serving as a glowing indictment of Chad's character. "Look at me, boy," Mike commanded, his voice a low, industrial rumble. Chad's eyes darted frantically, hoping for a security guard or a police cruiser. But the street was deserted. Logan, his supposed best friend, had already slinked backward into the shadows, abandoning Chad entirely. "I'll give him money," Chad stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. He reached for his wallet with a shaking hand. $5,000. Just let me get in my car." Mike didn't flinch. He clamped his heavy, leather-clad hand over Chad's wrist, stopping him. Chad gasped as the bones in his forearm ground together under the pressure. "You think you can buy back a man's dignity after treating him like a stray dog?" Mike asked, stepping so close his helmet almost touched Chad's perfectly styled hair. Behind Mike, the giant sergeant-at-arms named Dutch stepped forward. He didn't look at Chad. He was looking at Sebastian, who was still shivering violently against the brick wall. Dutch crouched down next to the old man. "You said you're a Marine," Dutch said softly, his voice surprisingly gentle. "What unit, brother?" Sebastian wiped muddy water from his eyelashes, eyeing the military rocker on Dutch's leather vest. "Tone Battalion," Sebastian rasped, his chest heaving as the cold set in. "First Marines, Echo Company." Dutch's eyes widened. He stood up slowly, turning to Mike. "Boss, Echo Company. They took the brunt of it during Operation Phantom Fury in Fallujah. My little brother was in Fox Company right next to them." Dutch looked back down at Sebastian. "What's your name, Marine?" "Bennett," Sebastian whispered. "Sebastian Bennett." "Gunnery Sergeant." A heavy murmur rippled through the ranks of the Hells Angels. Several older members stepped closer, their expressions shifting to absolute respect. "Gunny Bennett," Dutch said, his voice thick with sudden reverence. "My brother wrote letters about you. He said you dragged 4 wounded boys out of the kill zone while taking rounds to your own plates. You were awarded the Silver Star." Sebastian closed his eyes, a single tear cutting through the dark mud on his cheek. "I came back, but the cancer took my wife. After she died, the house went. Then the pension, then my mind. Now I'm just part of the pavement." The revelation hung in the freezing night air. The man Chad Harrington had just kicked gutter water onto was a decorated war hero, swallowed whole by a system that forgot him. Iron Mike slowly turned his gaze back to Chad. His eyes burned with a cold, righteous fury. "I didn't know." Chad sobbed, his knees buckling slightly. "It doesn't matter who he is," Mike roared, making Chad jump out of his skin. "He is a human being, and you treated him like garbage." Mike shoved Chad backward against the G-Wagon. "Take the coat off." Chad blinked, terrified. "What?" "The cashmere coat." "Take it off." Trembling violently, Chad scrambled to unbutton the expensive overcoat, slipping it off his shoulders until he stood only in a thin designer dress shirt. The freezing wind hit him instantly. Mike snatched the coat and tossed it to a tattooed angel named Bones. "Wrap that around the gunny." Bones respectfully draped the luxurious coat around Sebastian's shivering shoulders. Sebastian looked up, gratitude shining in his pale eyes. Mike pointed to the massive, freezing puddle of Black City mud that Chad had just kicked onto Sebastian. "Now," Mike said, "sit." Chad's eyes bulged in horror. "In the mud?" "Please no. It's freezing. I'll get sick." "Sebastian got sick," Mike replied coldly. "Sebastian is freezing, and you thought it was hilarious. You wanted a viral video, Chad. We're going to give you one." Mike raised Chad's phone, turning the camera to face the terrified rich kid. Dozens of other Hells Angels pulled out their own phones, hitting record. "Sit in the puddle," Mike commanded, "or I let my brothers teach you how to fall down." Slowly, humiliatingly, Chad dropped to his knees. The freezing, icy water soaked instantly through his designer trousers, shocking his system. He sank down until he was sitting flat in the deep, freezing slush. The cold was agonizing. He began to cry loud, ugly sobs of complete humiliation. "Now," Mike said, pointing the lens right at Chad's tear-streaked, muddy face, "you're going to look into this lens and say, 'I am a coward who preys on the weak.'" I am a coward," Chad blubbered, his teeth clicking together uncontrollably, "who preys on the weak." Louder, Dutch growled, "I am a coward WHO preys on the WH." Chad screamed into the camera, shivering violently in the gutter. Mike hit stop on the recording. He tapped the screen a few times, accessing Chad's social media profiles. With a single press, made a decision, but raffle hesitantly etched in none, knighting every local Seattle news outlet he could find. "There," Mike said, tossing the phone carelessly into the mud right into Chad's lap. "You went viral, kid." Chad scrambled to grab his phone from the muddy water, but his hands were shaking so badly he dropped it twice. The video was already live. Within seconds, the notifications began to ping. "You're walking home tonight," Mike told the sobbing boy in the puddle. "If we see this truck move before tomorrow morning, we're taking a baseball bat to every piece of glass on it. Understand?" Chad nodded frantically, unable to speak through his violent shivering. Mike turned his back on the broken bully, dismissing him entirely from his reality. He walked over to where Dutch and Bones were helping Sebastian to his feet. Sebastian looked small inside Chad's oversized cashmere coat, but the shivering had started to subside. "Gunny," Mike said softly, pulling off his heavy leather glove and extending his right hand. Sebastian looked at the hand, then up at Mike. Slowly, the old Marine reached out and grasped it. Mike's grip was firm, warm, and entirely respectful. "You're done sleeping on concrete," Mike told him, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We've got a clubhouse in Sodo. It's got heat, a hot shower, a kitchen that never closes, and a spare room with a real bed. You're riding with us tonight." Sebastian's chest heaved. For 5 years he had been entirely invisible, a ghost, a nuisance. To have 100 men stop the world for him, to treat him with the reverence he thought he had lost forever in the deserts of Iraq, was too much to process. "I can't pay you," Sebastian whispered. "I don't have anything." "You paid your tab in Fallujah, brother," Dutch said, clapping a massive hand gently onto Sebastian's shoulder. "Your money is no good here. Not tonight. Not ever." Bones walked over to his custom Harley, popping open one of the hard saddlebags. He pulled out a spare half-helmet and handed it to Sebastian. "Climb on the back of my rig, Gunny," Mike said, throwing his leg over his massive road glide. "Let's get you home." Sebastian secured the helmet, looking one last time at the soggy, ruined piece of cardboard that had been his entire identity for half a decade. He stepped over it, leaving it in the dirt, and climbed onto the back of Iron Mike's motorcycle. Mike fired up the engine. The massive V-twin roared to life, a deep, earth-shaking rumble. Instantly, all down the avenue, 99 other engines fired up in synchronized response. The thunder returned to Pioneer Square. With a unified kick into first gear, the pack began to roll out. They rode in a tight, protective formation, with Mike and Sebastian right at the point. As they rumbled down the avenue, leaving the steakhouse behind, Chad Harrington remained sitting in the freezing mud, watching his ruined life speed away in a cloud of exhaust. He was entirely alone. The aftermath of that cold November night echoed far beyond the streets of Seattle. Chad's viral video did exactly what he had always wanted. It got millions of views. But the internet is a ruthless judge. By the time the sun came up the next morning, Chad was the most hated man in the Pacific Northwest. Local news picked up the story, contrasting Chad's cruelty with the legendary record of Gunnery Sergeant Sebastian Bennett. Chad's father, a man who cared about public relations above all else, was furious. Facing a massive boycott of his real estate firm, the magnate publicly disowned Chad's actions, stripped him of his trust fund, and forced him to move out of his luxury condo. Chad was forced to take a minimum-wage landscaping job just to pay rent for a cramped studio apartment. Every time it rained, and the mud coated his boots, Chad remembered the terrifying roar of 100 engines and the cold reality of the gutter. As for Sebastian Bennett, The ride to the Hells Angels clubhouse was the beginning of a profound resurrection. The MC didn't just give him a hot meal and a bed for the night. They folded him into their community. Dutch, true to his word, reached out to the local Veterans Affairs office, using the MC's intimidating legal connections to cut through the red tape that had kept Sebastian from receiving his full military pension and psychiatric care. Within 6 months, Sebastian was off the streets permanently. He moved into a small, quiet apartment in West Seattle, funded entirely by his reinstated back pay. But more importantly, he wasn't alone anymore. The isolation that had driven him to the brink of despair was gone. A year later, Sebastian Bennett could be found 5 days a week at Iron and Thunder Customs, a motorcycle repair shop owned and operated by the local Hells Angels charter. Sebastian wasn't turning wrenches. His hands were too unsteady for that, but he ran the front office. He managed the books, ordered the parts, and greeted the customers. He wore clean jeans, a crisp button-down shirt, and his beard was neatly trimmed. And every Friday night, when the shop closed down, a massive black road glide would pull into the bay. Iron Mike would kick the stand down, walk into the office, and toss Sebastian a cold beer. They would sit on overturned milk crates listening to classic rock, swapping stories of brotherhood, survival, and the strange, unpredictable roads of life. Sebastian had gone into the mud, a broken, invisible ghost. But he was pulled out by an army of outcasts who proved that true honor doesn't wear a tailored suit, and family isn't just about blood. Sometimes family wears leather, rides on 2 wheels, and arrives exactly when the thunder rolls in. If this story moved you, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more incredible real-life stories of karma, redemption, and brotherhood. Remember, respect is earned, not bought, and you never know who might be watching when you think you're untouchable. Drop a comment below to honor our veterans. See you in the next video.